Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. I'm Amy Taylor from Civicus and the moderator of today's conversation. Before we get started, I wanted to share a big thank you for taking the time to join us today. For the past year, Civicus has worked closely with a group of grassroots activists, and they highlighted that one of the biggest issues they face is a lack of connection, mutual understanding, dialogue, and collaboration with funders and other enablers. So the purpose of today's call is to explore why building strong, equitable, and trust-based relationships is a crucial first step to supporting grassroots activism. So we'll first meet our panelists, do a round of interventions, and then open up the mic to the audience for questions. Today's panelists are the members of the Grassroots Changemakers teams. We have Samuel Sibet, co-founder of the grassroots organization Talent Initiative for Development in South Sudan. We have Naro Alonso, human rights activist with the organization KERI, Caring for Activists in the Philippines. We have Nawa Vili, a co-founder of the grassroots movement Youth for Parliament in Zambia. We have Dalia de la Certa, co-director of the feminist collective Moras Help Moras from Mexico, and Marie Cristina Colo, a climate activist, ecofeminist, and social entrepreneur from Madagascar. The panel is completed by Saranel Benjamin, Director of Partnerships, Oxfam GB, and Otto Saki, Program Officer with the Ford Foundation. So let's get started. This question is for Dalia and Nawa. The Grassroots Changemakers team spent months consulting with activists in Philippines, Mexico, Madagascar, South Sudan, and Zambia about their resourcing challenges, and they all highlighted the issue of poor relationships with donors, INGOs, and other enablers. Could you share what are the main relationship challenges and how are these challenges affecting the work of grassroots activists? Dalia, would you like to go first?
Sí, bueno, yo trabajo en una organización feminista que se llama Morras y Morras. Trabajamos en México. Nuestro proyecto más conocido se trata de dar información y acompañamiento a mujeres o personas con capacidad de gestar que quieren abortar en su casa utilizando medicamentos en contextos donde el aborto todavía es un crimen. Y pues el principal conflicto que nosotras tenemos con los y las donantes para seguir recibiendo recursos son muchos conflictos, pero creo que el que a nosotras en este momento nos tiene en jaque es la cantidad de requisitos burocráticos que nos piden, la cantidad de requisitos que son más de forma que de fondo. Por ejemplo, el hecho de que estemos constituidas legalmente. En este momento, por ejemplo, a nosotras en México ya no basta con estar constituidas legalmente, nos están exigiendo que seamos donatarias autorizadas, lo que significa un trámite burocrático ante las autoridades mexicanas mucho más tedioso, mucho más complicado de realizar y no nos dan alternativas. O sea, es de que o somos donatarias autorizadas o no nos van a seguir dando recursos. Y es algo complicado de conseguir y es algo complicado de gestionar. También, pues el hecho de que los donantes sacan convocatorias anuales o cada bianuales o cada año y medio y pues sacan convocatorias en las que participamos todas las organizaciones civiles, desde las chiquitas hasta las grandes. Y a nosotras nos toca competir contra organizaciones que tienen 15, 20 personas y nosotras, por ejemplo, somos 4. Entonces, tenemos que hacer todo el trabajo que ya realizamos que es atender 50 mensajes diarios de mujeres y personas con capacidad gestal que quieren abortar, que necesitan el medicamento, más talleres, más creación de contenidos y todavía tenemos que realizar proyectos o responder a convocatorias de donantes que muchas veces tienen 70 preguntas que son repetitivas, que son solicitudes difíciles de llenar, inaccesibles para muchas personas que no tienen la infraestructura para contestarlas. Y luego se viene el tema de que la mayoría de los donantes, las donantes, dan apoyo para proyectos, no para apoyo en general. Entonces a nosotras eso nos hace que cada año, año y medio estemos metiendo nuestras solicitudes con proyectos diferentes para mantener los gastos de nuestra organización, porque la mayoría de donantes da para apoyar proyectos específicos y no para apoyos en general. Entonces tenemos como esta complicación de los procedimientos para solicitar apoyo que son largos y tediosos, de que la competencia no es en equidad para todas las organizaciones civiles porque competimos, digamos que con los mismos requisitos, con organizaciones grandes, pero no en igualdad de circunstancias. Y que hay pocos apoyos para apoyos en general y que la mayoría son para proyectos. Entonces es como destapar un hoyo para llenar otro. Siempre estamos metiendo un proyecto nuevo para mantener los gastos de nuestra organización. Y creo que lo más importante es que muchos donantes no ven lo que nosotras realizamos como un trabajo. O sea, sí ven que lo que ellos realizan como donantes en sus organizaciones es un trabajo al que le dedican 8 horas, 6 horas, donde tienen ciertas obligaciones, donde tienen compañeros, compañeras de trabajo, pero lo que nosotras hacemos no lo ven como un trabajo, ven como si lo que nosotras hacemos fuera como simplemente altruismo, como un hobby o como algo que hacemos de corazón y la realidad es que esto es un trabajo. Yo a esto le invierto por lo menos 12 horas diarias, 8 horas diarias. Trabajo días festivos y es un trabajo como cualquier otro. Entonces, como esta dinámica de ver que es algo como que las y las activistas de base hacemos por mero compromiso, que no hay detrás trabajo real que debería de ser dignificado y remunerado, hace que pues como que recreemos estas dinámicas verticales de caridad. Y bueno, sería lo que yo tendría que decir, no sé qué más tenga que agregar. Creo que quién es Nahua o Sam.
So I was going to ask Nawa to come in and to see if he had any other kinds of relationship challenges to add to what you've already shared.
Yes, I actually do have a comment to add on to what Dalia had shared. So I think one of the main issues that we discovered in the dialogue that we had, when it comes to relationships between donors and activists, is that there really isn't a anything that you would call a relationship. It's just a people that collaborate on activities. Um, that's basically the relationship that is there between donors and activists. There's no there is beyond the human faith, or I mean beyond the project. There's nothing attached to that relationship. So, for example, when we had our first dialogue, our second dialogue, so where we had activists and donors in one room, when people were walking into the room in the morning, the activists automatically start on one side of the room and the donors start on the other side of the room. That in itself communicates to you that there's already a divide between the two. And even just sharing the names. I remember there was a time when an activist was sharing reflections and they mentioned the organization they were from. And the donor said, and one of the people who was in the room who was coming from a donor organization said, I know your organization. I just didn't know that you are the one who is in that organization, but I've seen you on Facebook before. And the reason is because there is just a relationship of being activists looking at donors as people that just give them resources to do activities, and donors looking at activists as just individuals or groupings that execute activities. Beyond that, there is no understanding or proper understanding of what exactly do activists do, who exactly are activists. There's no intention or efforts that are made between the two parties to create a relationship that just goes beyond the project that they're implementing on behalf of the donor, or the project that the activist that the donor is funding to the activist. There's no intentional effort to create relationships beyond the project. It's just every time there is a conversation that is held between a donor and an activist, in most circumstances, it's just about the project. Even just the hi, how are you part is just said as a process of just setting the tone of the meeting. But there's no really a effort that goes towards knowing beyond the project who the activist is or what the donor stands for. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges that we had found in the consultations that we were doing, the dialogues that we're doing between activists and donors.
Thanks, Nawa. And we're going to try to shift soon to get to kind of more proactive steps that we can take to improve our relationships. But before we do, I'm going to put Otto on the spot, because of course we know that there's a growing number of donors and enabling organizations who are committing more resources to grassroots groups. And yet activists like Nawa and Dalia, as they shared, they still don't feel like they're being treated as true partners. They don't see that their agency or their well-being or their autonomy is being valued. And there's mistrust and disconnection, and that's really blocking the flow of care and resources that they need. So what's your take on this? From the perspective of a donor and a funder, where are we coming short, and why?
Yeah, thanks so much, Amy, and my appreciation to Dalia and Nawa for being very forthright in sharing their experiences. And I should say that my reflections might not cover the extent of the parameters of foundations and of bilaterals, so I might be limited and constrained in that respect. But be that as it may, this is certainly a timely conversation. I think we need to place it in the backdrop of the context that we are in at the moment, right? We are seeing climate catastrophe. We are seeing, the ravaging of COVID pandemic and vaccine inequality. We're seeing many forgotten and invisible wars in Yemen, in Syria, DRC. We're seeing the rise of military coups. Others are talking of democratic regression, collapse of democracy building projects, Afghanistan, Libya, Iraq, the recent invasion of Ukraine, conflict in Ethiopia, food crisis. The list is endless, and we can choose to arpeggiate in these conflicts and become accustomed to them. But I think at the core of this is how we are working and partnering with communities that are seeking to advance change. And there's an unspoken frame around these conversations, which I think we need to tackle. And this remains the issue of power and rest. I think this is a very difficult issue, but at some point we all have to start grappling with it. And if you then add to that, patriarchy, misogyny, urbanism, class, and all, you really produce a very toxic mix. Having said that, I should note there have been a few and several efforts, in trying to change the approaches and practices from private funders and from, bilaterals. And a lot still needs to be done. I'm not here to whitewash and to say, oh, Eureka, we've made it. Not at all. I think there still is a lot that needs to be done. And an example that I will give is what just yesterday, there was a report that was released by Momentum, new findings showing how funders need to break the NGO starvation cycle. Granted, it is an NGO starvation and not grassroots, but I'll probably replace NGO and use and say grassroots intervention. And those findings will be applicable with minor modifications here and there. And that is an effort that was started by funders for real cost and real change, which include a few private funders, including Ford Foundation, among others. And I think what we need to emphasize are the two first points that Dalia and Nawa raised, that we need to humanize these conversations. And the moment that you see Dalia and Nawa as individuals who are committed to seeing change in their countries and in the world, then our lenses become, very different. And once we humanize our conversations and humanize each other, then we are moving towards transformational relations. Because what we are hearing, and what I've heard at least, is more that these are transactions. It's like you're just walking into the shop and you get what you want and you walk out. You don't even greet the shop attendant. Now with automated systems, you're probably going at an automated checkout system. So you don't talk to anyone. So it's a transaction and there's no need for you to connect with the other person. So I think is what is important, pursuing of transformational relationships. And the only way to do that is to have a long-term partnership, right? And project support, which I think Dalia mentioned, does not encourage long-term partnerships. And it's so driven by deliverables and probably short-term deliverables. And the last point that I'll just mention on this is that, trust building is a difficult and a messy process to build trust. And unfortunately, because there's this unequal power dynamic, it even becomes difficult for grassroots organizations and groups, because funders are always asking, are they trustworthy? But the question should actually be asked the other way around. Are funders trustworthy? Can the funds or the resources that you're bringing to the table be trusted that they are in for good and are actually going towards what is required for that community? So this should be a multidimensional conversation, trust building, transformational relations, and humanizing each other. And the more we see each other as human beings with feelings, with emotions, with attachments, with lives, intersectional identities, I think the better we might be able to respond to this. Back to you, Amy.
Thanks, Otto. I think, yes, valuing each other as human beings is an important first step. So shifting a bit now, Tina, I was hoping that you could speak a bit to what grassroots activists consider good relationships. We've heard a bit from Otto. And if you could please be as specific as possible, any examples of characteristics of a good relationship, as well as any insights that you've had throughout this process in terms of the kinds of spaces and engagements that really kind of nurture these relationships in a meaningful way.
Hi, so yes, Otto shared a little bit about it. I really like the word humanize the conversation, humanize each other, because as grassroots activists, we often see big international NGOs, big foundation donors as people who do not really understand reality, why we are fighting. They do not understand our daily battles, our daily lives, and how passionate we are. Sometimes they consider us as just superheroes. They invite us to some conference as panelists, but then they do not work closely to us, and they continue to have this kind of top-down project where they pretend that they are working with the communities, where it's not often the reality. Whereas, so this is how we often view the donors, whereas the donors, they see us as yes, passionate people, but we are not, they want, they want to give their money to people who can organize themselves, who have structure. They need this process for their, for transparency. And the main problem is the problem of trust. We do not have a space where, donors and change makers and grassroots movement, we are able to discuss, to understand each other, understand why there is so much process, bureaucratic procedures, whereas they do not understand why we need to have more freedom, more. They need to simplify this process for us, because in the end, we are the first one. We are in the front lines, and I often say that as grassroots change makers, as grassroots activists, we are like these invisible experts on the ground that people do not consider, people do not recognize and value. But we are the expert on the ground. We are with the communities. We are fighting for and with the communities. And now to have, in order to have a better relationship together, both of us need to make some efforts to understand each other, to have a dedicated space where there is no taboo, where we can talk about things like decolonization, our relationship, for example. We can talk about we can talk about patriarchy. How patriarchy is affecting actually our relation too. And yes, as I said, we of course it's important to simplify the process. It's important also for us activists to also be more understood by these donors. And I'd like to finish by saying that behind behind each activist, there's a story, there's a battle. And most of the time when, for example, I'm invited to speak with some founders and donors, they ask me about my work, my impact, etc. They do not ask me why I started everything, and why it's also important for me and for my community. Each one of us, we have a story that is part of our experience, that needs to be recognized, and that should be the beginning of this relation of don't know if if I'm clear enough, but I'd like to emphasize, the fact that we do not discuss each other enough. So yes, let's put ourselves in the other person's shoes. Is it how we say it in English? I'm not sure if I'm clear enough, but yeah, let's try to be to have more empathy and accept to also be vulnerable. Because we know, as activists, we know that we're not perfect, that that we are struggling a lot. And Dalia shared about the fact that we have needs to, it's a full-time job that we have, and we sometimes we do not have rest. So so yes, that's my answer. hope it's clear enough for you.
It's perfect for me, and I'm sure that everyone with us also appreciated that. Thank you, Tina. And I am really happy to see that Naro has also been able to join us. So I'm going to pass over to you in just a second and let you introduce yourself. But first, Saranel, I just wanted to pick up kind of on a point that Dalia mentioned earlier. And talking about the partnerships between grassroots activists and groups and INGOs, and how there's a competition element in terms of the resources and the infrastructure available to support the pursuit of those resources. as well as our engagement kind of tactics and approaches, and how we often unintentionally replicate the kind of top-down relationships that we have with power holders and decision makers and funders. And I was wondering if you had ideas, given the work of Oxfam GB, on how INGOs can redefine their roles and approaches and cultivate better relationships and solidarity with grassroots groups.
Thank you so much, Amy. Yeah, I really like that. You know, there's some really good work, really good narrative coming through that's bringing out issues around power. And, you know, Tina just mentioned colonialism and decolonization and the need to be bringing that into conversations around partnerships. And I think specifically from, you know, the experience of Oxfam, both GB as well as the Confederation, is that this idea of partnerships and creating equal partnerships or even equitable partnerships cannot be done unless there is a reckoning with the legacy of international aid and international development, and knowing or recognizing and naming the fact that that legacy is very much rooted in a colonial legacy. And international aid and international development, you know, has been a replicator and an enabler of that to, you know, to continue even in present day time. The way in which I can see that showing up in Oxfam is in the way in which, firstly, the hierarchy, the structure of the organization and the hierarchy that exists. So not just only within OGB, because it is you know, it is a very hierarchical organization, but also a hierarchy of power in the way in which the Confederation's own ecosystem has been set up between those that are based, those parts of Oxfam that are based in the north, with those parts of Oxfam that are based in the south, and it's the relationship then with global civil society, including civil society in the global south. That power dynamic is maintained and enabled by you know, institutional structures that have been put in place, and it's further enabled and perpetuated through the endless bureaucratic processes that Dalia had mentioned as well, you know, just being burdened with compliance and endless paperwork. And these are really it's coming from that colonial mindset, which is about maintaining control because of a lack of trust or because of mistrust. And that has been the whole, you know, that has been one of the core features of colonialism. So in order for us to decolonize, in order for us to change our practice, we're going to have to decolonize our practice. And I know that it's different when we talk about decolonization, particularly an organization like Oxfam GB, which is based in the seat of colonial empire. It is sitting in that power. And so it means a very different thing when you know, people of color within Oxfam GB are calling for Oxfam GB to decolonize its partnership model. And for me, what that means is that it's not just a simple shifting of power, because that's what it's come to mean. And I think this is probably why, you know, Dalia and Nawa were saying at the beginning how this is not being felt, this kind of shifting of power, even though INGOs are talking about it and donors are talking about it. One of the reasons why it's not being felt by you know, grassroots change makers or grassroots organizations in the global south, or indigenous organizations in the global south, is because it has become largely a tick box technical exercise. So, you know, it's not about meaningful shifting of power where it is based on autonomy, where it is based on building systems and structures of trust. It is still about maintaining control, but with a slight bit of rhetoric around shifting power. And we also have to be careful about what we are shifting. So are we transferring risk? Are we transferring, all of and the risk is not only around transferring all of the compliance risk to the global south, but it's also about the risk that, frontline workers are facing through implementing projects that have been designed without their input, without the context being taken into account. This kind of, one of the, from experience, when we first started talking about decolonization in OGB, one of the red flag moments for me was how easily the word was rolling off the tongues of my white colleagues who are British and based in the UK. And there's a reason why that was happening, was because it had become a technical tick box exercise, a checklist of how can we shift power without interrogating what that power actually is. And if you're really, taking a colonial lens of analysis to power, then it's going to be far more than shifting funding, shifting risk and compliance. We're talking about something that is fundamentally disruptive, or has to be fundamentally disrupted in order to do that. And so that is why we've brought into our decolonial partnerships work the connection to racial justice. So racial justice is very much a central part, or almost a driving feature, of our work on decolonial partnerships. We can't have decolonization without racial justice, and we can't have racial justice without decolonization. It has to be at the center of the work we are doing, where racialized power is the lens of analysis that we're using to interrogate why it is that power is still being held in the global north, and why shifting money is not the answer. It's one element of it, but it's not the silver bullet to this, and why you need to be taking a less of an instrumentalized approach to power shifting, and starting to look at things with a lot more of a political intent rather than a technical exercise. Back to you, Amy.
Thank you. I saw a lot of heads nodding. So I think that really resonated and was really also fascinating for a power analysis. I am really pleased that our activist Naro, Grassroots Changemaker Naro, and I also see Sam have been able to join. So we'll take two more interventions before we close out this session. Naro, I know you've been engaging with donors and other enablers in the Philippines. And of course, you also joined this kind of pilot online dialogue with international donors and enablers. And I'm wondering if you could reflect on what you've learned from this, that could potentially help us to push this collective transformation further.
Hi, so maayong adlaw sa tanan. Good day to everyone. And I'm speaking really from the vantage point of being a wellness activist. So I'm an activist that supports mainly the well-being of social justice defenders in the Philippines. And for me, what is very striking from the stories that I have heard on the ground, and so throughout that 1 year engagement and journey we've had together, my main focus really was just to collect the stories and narratives of activists in the grassroots about their well-being, about their experiences. Because when we're talking about power, we mentioned how it looks like in an institutional level, in the systematic level. My focus now is in the individual level. So how does that look like within the individual, within the activist? How does that relate? How does that power appear when we're talking about social justice movements? And one of the things that I have heard from fellow activists on the ground when it comes to focusing really on that trust is how locally in the Philippines, there's this very strong stigmatization on the word activist. And so in the Philippines, there are those who would say that they're advocates, but they're not activists. And that differentiation is enough to is enough uh, for you to not actually receive any grants at all. So if you are an advocate, you have more privileges when it comes to being able to receive aid and support and resources. All of the activists that I know who identify themselves as activists have never received a single grant from any NGO. Instead, they would rather conduct autonomous or self-financing methods. For example, they would find ways to create craftsmanship or other ways of funding their own work. And at times they would use their own financial capacities. So money from their own pocket would be used to fund their own activism, because there's this sense that it is a very scary, it's very frightening, for example, for some enablers or donors to support activist organizations, because you would also be experiencing the same stigma coming, for example, from the government. And so even just that one word, right? Just that one word of being an activist is enough to completely change the ways and approaches of one's activism. And it completely changes the way, for example, two people can be together. I remember one activist saying that for there to be a transformative relationship and for that to be done, enablers and donors needs to join us on the ground. We need to see each other on the streets. We need to see each other in the rallies, in the protests, instead of sterile rooms, for example, in an office or in a conference somewhere outside of the country. Because that, they would say that those spaces are for the advocates. Because the activist is always on the ground. We are always on the ground. And so I think personally, when we're talking about decolonization, this really involves an intergenerational form of healing that stems also not just from our systems and institutions, but also within our own selves, within our own personhood, whether as activists or as enablers or as a donor. And to acknowledge, for example, the discomfort for donors and activists, or for donors or enablers who are doing activist work but refuse to identify as an activist. And there are those instances of stigma that is a daily reality. And so for my encounters of the stories on the ground, what really comes out is this importance for us to be able to support each other's identities as activists, to surface the activists among all of us, and perhaps to really interrogate and unpack that word of what it means to be involved in activism, and and for us to be able to really practice that solidarity that we keep on mentioning. How can we do that if it will only be activists on the ground? And who those activists are remains to be a question, and it remains to be uncertain. And I think that in this room, for example, the activists here aren't just the change makers, but the goal is for everyone here in this room right now to actually become activists and join us in this movement, in this transformation, in this decolonization, and in this personal and systematic healing journeys, so that we can transform the relationships that we have and unpack that power. I think that's it for my end.
No, I love hearing you speak every time. Thank you. And another person I love to hear from is Sam. So I'm really pleased that you were able to join us. And I'm giving you the final word for this part of the conversation. To close off, I'm wondering, what would you say are the collective actions that activists, donors, enablers should start taking to promote this urgent transformation to their relationships? I'm struggling with the audio. Is anyone else?
Yeah, we cannot hear you, Sam.
All right. Well, Sam relocates because I'm still keeping the final word for Sam. I'm also going to suggest a slight change of plans in the running order for this conversation. And we'll do it by an impromptu kind of poll. So everyone might need to turn off your cameras and raise your hands because I haven't set up a poll. But we have two choices. We could continue the conversation in plenary and take questions and answers and use the remainder of our time together like that together. Or we could go straight into the breakout groups, which will be facilitated by each of the activists and kind of discuss different questions and follow-ups in our smaller groups. So, power of the people. If you would like to stay in plenary, turn off or turn on your video and raise your hand. Okay. Well, if you ever want to do a disco in a webinar, this is what it looks like. Okay, great. So I see lots of raised hands. Okay, great. Let's hope that there's no audits of this exercise at the end. I can't speak exactly for the data integrity here. Okay, but I have just short of 30 participants who are happy to stay in plenary. Can I ask that you put your hand down? And for option 2, we move straight into breakout groups and we have a more personal conversation. If you could raise your hand. Thank you, Leonardo. I see your hand up proudly. Here they come. And Sam, while I count names, do you want to try your audio again? No, I still can't hear you.
What about now? Are you able to hear me?
Yes, yes, I can. I can. And my impromptu poll tells me that we're staying in plenary. So please, if you want to respond to kind of any concrete actions that we should be taking collectively to transform our relationships, we'll then move into Q&A in the plenary. Thanks, Sam.
All right, thank you. So a collective actions that we could take now. Number one thing that I really want to put forward is, as already some things are mentioned by my colleagues, is the question of trust. And I think one of the key issues that is killing us is trying to deprive our growth as activists and with funders is that there is completely a loss of trust that lack of trust between activists, donors, and enablers. So sometimes it's very difficult for funders who are based outside our own countries to be able to understand grassroots movements and activists in particular, and what kind of level they should be able to come into support. And I think we keep on emphasizing that for several times. So the funding system, for example, where I am is based on the know who. So if, for example, Oxfam knows who Sam is and what Tide does, there is going to be a bit of an opportunity that maybe such an organization can be able to get funding. And if we're able then to look at ourselves as, I remember Tina mentioned that we both have the power to change these narratives, but then the question would be, how would we move forward from there? So the comfort zones that we've already created for ourselves, first of all, to me, I think there is the feeling of superiority, being superior, and then the other people are looked at inferior in terms of the activism. So like funders sometimes have got the power that, yes, we have the money, and we will decide where to send this money, who exactly to implement these projects. This is what is happening exactly. Meanwhile, we activists also have got the power. So to me, I'm looking at you, funders and enablers having the money and activists having the power. Now you would have the money, but if you do not have these grassroots organizations or activists on the ground in the particular countries that you want to work in, to be able to receive this money and then being able to move forward to implement the activities that you have spared or you have raised that money for, then in the end, you are not doing something. This money will remain in your accounts forever and ever. There will not be any change that we'll be able to see. But if we're able to accept that, yes, we as funders will send this money strictly down to the grassroots organizations directly, so then they're able to implement activities, then I see the power of collectively working together. Then we can be able to see a change around that particular corner there. And also there is this point of shifting power or maybe delegating without devolution. So many times in part of the interactions that we've had with some funders, I think a question that comes out is that, yes, I might be put in charge of grant making, for example, in a particular organization, but then I do not hold the absolute power to be able to decide, now this fund has to go to for example, Tina's organization, it has to go maybe to Civicus, to Oxfam, wherever, or to Tide. I will still have to go back behind me to the board of this particular organization that would have the final power to decide who exactly this is going to be. Now, if we're talking about shifting power and we want to see change, I think it is also very important that we begin looking at the next future of resourcing, the next future of civil society, where we empower people 100%, we give them the power, and then on how they should be able to distribute funds. Maybe that will change the narrative a little bit. Another also point that I want to make is that there's the idea of the restricted, actually the funding policies. I want to talk about the criteria that are being set in place by funders. This is absolutely very, very difficult for some other emerging organizations. For example, let me talk about Tide. Tide is just now in its third year and in operation as legally registered. But now it is going to stop us from competing for other resources with other organizations that have been existing the last 10 or 5 to 6 years. So some funders, when they're making out calls for proposal for funding, they will tell you clearly that now from here, this organization must have been existing for the last 5 years. You should have a budget of at least 1.5 million. And then also you as organization, your capacity has to be very well. And then this becomes very difficult, first of all. Now, why I'm saying this is that most of the work that is being done, it is by these grassroots movements, these grassroots activists, because they themselves sit at the center of the communities where these projects that needed to be implemented. And then they know exactly what challenge their communities are facing. So they can be able to design best practices, best activities that can be able to cap that particular issue. But then it is very difficult. Many times they're being kicked out because they do not have that particular, they do not meet the criteria to move forward. Another point that I think it is important that we collectively start envisioning and maybe removing is the point of audited reports. Now, some funders, for example, Tide, the list grant we got, we're given something like you have maybe 3,000, like you have $3,000 as a funding or 5,000, and this money has to run, for example, for 3 months or 6 months. And in this money, you have to pay staff, so you have to pay office rent, you have to implement activities. And it's like kind of very difficult in this. Now, again, they will be asking you that they need audited reports. Now, in some of these projects, they don't even tell you to allocate some money for auditing. So how do I get audited reports when I don't have a specific section of funds that is being put forward for auditing? So this becomes very challenging also for activists, like grassroots activists like us who are here. I think this is also one of the main reasons as we're into this campaign, so that we see a change of mindset, we see things have to move in the right way. So then we can be able to see a society where we can be able to compete regardless of the year you've started. Now, in the local context, just here, and I believe maybe in other parts of this country where my fellow activists are coming from, would be also the same thing, that even we have donor organizations and international organizations that are competing for very small money of maybe 20,000, 10,000, even 100,000 with local organizations. Now, these are people who have over maybe 10,000 above that are working in their organizations. In the end, you find that much of this funding goes for administrative work, costs, and so on. Very little go down into grassroots activism. And then they will apply also, for example, here in South Sudan, we have got the UN OCHA that is competing to apply for grants of 300,000 so that they're able to get this funding. And then they want to sub-grant this money to local organizations to implement. Yet they have a capacity of about maybe 100 staff nationwide that are working. So how realistic are these kind of things that are working out? How possible is this going to work for us? So to me, I think it is high time that we start looking at a particular set of maybe amounts that maybe grassroots organizations would be the one to go for, or something like that. So to me, these are some of the few things that I really just wanted to mention around there. Maybe then we can be able to see moving forward here as funders and activists that are already here. And then the idea of competitions would really have to be put off. And then we have to start acknowledging the truth. My colleague mentioned the issue of us donors, for example, and are looking at us activists as part of the powerful community of people who has all the resources they needed to run their movements. It is a very naked lie here. Sometimes they hear you, for example, like me, some is advocating at the global level, and my colleagues, they'll be like, oh, something, but the reality is not the case. We too are human beings that we needed also part of the resources to be able to continue living our welfare, first of our mental health. So in the end, ourselves trying to use the little resources that we even have from other households to fund our own activities, to see that, yes, there's problems our communities are facing are addressed. If it is peace building, if it is capacity building, trainings and whatever, we are trying to put that resources. So it is high time that now maybe funders have to start looking at the perspective of us activism as a normal human being who has also the dark side of life that needed to move on with that. So I just wanted to end here so we can be able to move to the next. And a point of raise is that funders are also looking at the aspect of if I'm white in color and my organization has got such a person, for example, it is where now I can easily be able to get funding, from other international organizations. The issues of race here is very, very difficult for us, and it becomes very challenging. Now, for example, we have got people who are brought to work in South Sudan who are put responsible to manage partnerships and grants making. And in the end, these people even don't have a particular understanding of the local context, maybe in the Philippines, in Madagascar, in Zambia. They don't have all those. Now, this person is put here. How do you expect such a person to understand really the context and be able to give the respective resources to that particular organization, the community that needs support more? In the end, there's the element of biasness that is going to really come out. So to me, I feel now it is important. If, for example, Civicus is establishing an office in South Sudan, can they be able to get a local person to head a particular department that is responsible with partnerships and seeing that, because now this person is able to understand the communities in this country and is able to direct where funding go and not. So to me, that's the last point I want to make. I'm sorry for taking long. Thank you.
No, thanks, Sam. I love the breadth of this conversation. We've gone from philosophical to super practical. And again, I'd just like to thank all of the panelists for being so open and forthcoming with your personal kind of experiences and insights, because that's what makes this feel real. And we have had so many questions in the chat. I don't know how we're ever going to start to prioritize. So I'm going to ask participants, if you don't mind putting up your hand, if you have a question, we'll try to hit. I've done a terrible job with time management, but we have at least 20 minutes for Q&A, and we'll get through as many as we can. And if you could also try to direct your question to a specific panelist, that would be super helpful. So unless you prefer me to go back through the chat and find people, please raise your hands with any questions that you might have at this point. And I know the raise hand function works because you used it so well when you voted for plenary. All right. I see Ben is our first brave soul. Would you like to come in?
Sure. Thank you all for your time and work and for sharing that. I really appreciate the experience and insights. We talked a bit about how outside support can pull the attention of organizers away from their communities, from the work on the ground, to speaking with people in London or New York or Joburg, or to speak to donors instead and be with donors as opposed to being with the community, and how the sort of self-resourcing, autonomous resourcing is actually more important usually than outside support for movements to win and to succeed. And so I'm curious from the organizers, activists here, what types of support, financial or otherwise, in-kind donations and things, what types of support it has been most useful for you from outside donors? And what types of support has been most sort of harmful? Thanks.
Great, thanks. I see we have two other hands raised. If it's okay, if our panelists could take notes of the questions, and then we'll take a round of questions and a round of responses. So I have Solna next, and then Anna, and then we'll pause for responses.
All right. Hello, everyone. Awesome conversation, we seem to be having here. I should say that this is not a usual conversation, but I think this will be most helpful for several activists, several grassroots organizations, because again, most times it's the donor that says, look, this is what we need to do. This is how we need to do it. This is our idea. And sometimes the idea is already totally conceived and you are just trying to help them also tick the box. So my question would relate to the point around trust building. So I know that a number of grassroots organizations thrive more from the angle of passion than from the angle of building institutions, building organizations, trying to stay very structured. But most times, even when grassroots organizations do very amazing job, it's not often that you see the donor organization putting information in the public space about those organizations. But if you flip it to the other side, for whatever reason, if there's mismanagement of funds, if there's something that went wrong with project implementation, you hear that easily all over the place. that organization is blacklisted. So I just think it should be a double standard. So my question is really trying to understand, why don't we have that, clearly from donor organizations to say, look, we just did, we worked with 300 community-based organizations in 2022, for instance, and we found 105 of them very outstanding. I think it helps the credibility of those organizations. Again, finally, for me, without trying to play the devil's advocate, I also think that, activist organizations, grassroots organizations also need to learn the process of growth. You can't stay small forever. You can't be small, 10 years, 15 years down the line, you're still the same. You need to do something. And this is where, I feel donor organizations also need to begin to think through sustainability. How do we sustain these small organizations to become big? Is it possible, for example, in Zimbabwe, there's a community-based organizations, hub for, small nonprofit organizations, a 3-story building, housing different small organizations. That takes rent off, most of our headaches. So we see this happening within the tech space, for instance. Tech guys would leverage on, tech hubs. So why don't we have nonprofit hubs as well, especially for smaller organizations, especially for smaller groups within the grassroots who are also trying to grow. So you can stay in the tech hub, in the nonprofit hub for 3 years. After 3 years, you have to grow out of that space. That gives them a lot of dynamics. And I was sharing in the group as well about people within donor organizations who have not worked in smaller nonprofit organizations before. It's always difficult for them to understand the dynamics of those spaces. I think they also need to come into intern in those places. Imagine someone from Ford Foundation coming to intern with Samuel's organization in South Sudan. That would be fantastic, spending 3 weeks there, seeing how Samuel is trying to, fundraise his problems. So it becomes easier to contextualize some of these issues. Those will be my thoughts, this afternoon here in Nigeria. Thank you.
Thank you, Sola. One last question from Anna before we go back to our panelists.
Yeah, this is both a question and a comment. I am an activist here in Venezuela, and I work with democracy building, and I run a gender think tank in the region. And actually, all of the things that the panelists mentioned are 100% true in many different environments. And that's the thing that it's more highlighted for me of this whole conversation, that even if we are in different circumstances, we face similar issues. So in that matter, I want to frame how my ideal donor relationship would be. And it's it doesn't necessarily have to be external support, as it was mentioned. External support does not need to be disconnected from internal matters. We need to understand that we all have a role to play, and we are the ones that have internal connections, but you are the ones that have the external ones. So in that sense, I see that sometimes donors work with a lot of similar ideas in different parts of the world, but they're disconnected from one another. And there's many things we can learn from each other, from the donor platform, not just being a provider of funding, but being a provider of connections and of knowledge and of accompanying an infrastructure, more as a platform for grassroots environment, and to be able to scale up for just being a small grassroots activist organization or person or individual to being an institution that works sustainably to reach some goals. So I think that's the goal for all of us. We've all experienced uncertainty with our future, with what we can do, with the things that we're doing. We have all had that crisis of, hey, if I am using all my young years into doing something for a cause, how would this provide a sustainable future for me? We also don't want to live from a funder our entire life. That's not the goal for us. And I think if we reach a more open conversation, and we realize how we can work hand in hand, knowing the context, knowing the person, that will create a more rich environment for grassroots activism and for sustainable change. And in that sense, going around the question of what has helped and what has not, the best experience I've had with donors has been the ones that have constant communication, and that we shift the projects in the middle, and we find new ways to do things, and we connect with other things that maybe weren't in our internal landscape. Those has been the best connections, and the worst ones has been having a seed funding that just comes out of nowhere, and you never contact the donor, and after a year you need to send a report. That's the worst relationship you can have. So yeah, I share my experience. I would love to hear that experience from the other panelists.
Thank you, Anna. That's fantastic. And I will ask that a couple of our grassroots change makers respond to that. I think it's fantastic. What's worked and what hasn't worked in your relationships. I'm also going to ask Dalia to maybe respond to Ben's question, given how at the very beginning of our conversation, you highlighted the kind of how the bureaucracy and the kind of transaction cost of engaging with funders and enablers is taking you away from your core work and your mission, when what you really need to be doing is supporting the people that you're working with in your community. So if you don't mind fielding Ben's question. Sola, there was a lot there. So I'm going to focus on the sustainability question. And again, go to a couple of our grassroots change makers with a really practical question in terms of what do you need to sustain your work and achieve your ambitions and what it is. Because we all know that the kinds of changes that we want to see, these aren't projects that you can implement when you want to tackle patriarchy or colonialism or racism or patriarchy. Those are durable challenges that need to be supported in the longer term. So Dalia, if you can respond to Ben's question around how to better support activists to do their work. Sola's question, I'm going to maybe ask Nalba, we haven't heard from you for a bit, in terms of what do you need in terms of sustaining your work. And then for Anna's question on the kind of what's worked and what hasn't, given our short time that we have left together, I'm going to ask that every single one of our panelists answer that in a single sentence format. So Dalia, first over to you.
Bueno, primero me gustaría responder la de una buena praxis y es capacitación. Hace poco Fondos Semillas nos pagó una capacitación a sus copartes en la que nos hablaron sobre elaboración de proyectos basados en la teoría del cambio, en cómo crear instrumentos de evaluación, nosotras como organización, y para presentar a los donantes y cómo hacer informes que cumplan con las especificaciones cuantitativas y cualitativas para que podamos tener una relación de confianza con los donantes. Y me pareció una buena práctica que tuvieran la iniciativa de formarnos en estos temas para que podamos tener, pues cumplir un poco mejor con estos requisitos. Y respecto a lo otro, que era el tema de sobre, o sea, cómo creo yo que pudiéramos nosotros enfocarnos nuestro trabajo. Yo creo que se pueden construir relaciones de confianza y de transparencia simplificando los informes que nosotras y nosotros como activistas presentamos, que no sean tanto informes que se queden solo por cumplirle a al donante, sino que sean informes que sirvan para visibilizar el trabajo que realizamos y al mismo tiempo transparentar el trabajo que estamos realizando, pero también que sirvan para demostrarle al donante que sí estamos trabajando. Y no sé, podrían ser formas más creativas, ¿saben? Como videos, algún mini documental del trabajo que realizamos. Por ejemplo, nosotras damos talleres de justicia reproductiva y derechos sexuales en las periferias y creo que en lugar de hacer un informe donde dijera, dimos talleres a 800 personas, a 800 adolescentes de las periferias, grabar un mini documental del trabajo que realizamos directamente con esas jóvenes y jóvenes de los entornos rurales en los que están, de qué piensan, qué necesitan, cómo son las dinámicas de estos talleres, todo el aprendizaje que nos deja trabajar, creo que sería como más ilustrativo del trabajo que realizamos, pero también sería más vistoso, tanto para los donantes, mostrar, esta es una organización en la que estamos apoyando, esto es lo que están haciendo, como nosotras como organización civil, transparentar lo que estamos haciendo. Y creo que pues es esto, hacer que los reportes sean más amigables de hacer, más fáciles de hacer, para que nosotras podamos enfocarnos en trabajar en lo que hacemos, que es pues el activismo, pero que al mismo tiempo podamos pues transparentar el trabajo que se está haciendo y apostar mucho más por los apoyos de apoyo general. Nosotras en este momento tenemos un donante que nos dio recursos para apoyo en general, que nos dijo, no necesitan presentarme proyecto, a mí me gusta el trabajo que ustedes ya están realizando y les voy a dar recursos para que ustedes lo inviertan en pagar salarios y que mantengan estos proyectos que ya tienen, que están funcionando, como la línea de aborto, que ha demostrado que funciona y que a mí me gusta. Y creo que es algo que los donantes podrían empezar a implementar, apoyos generales. Y creo que por mi parte ya sería todo y cedo la palabra al compañero o compañera que siga.
Thank you so much. Nawa, if you can answer in a minute, it would be so good. Because I would like to hear from you in terms of what you need to sustain your work, to achieve what it is that you want to see. And then I'm going to go through a quick round, one sentence for each panelist, sharing what has worked or hasn't in your relationships. Okay, but Nama, to you first, please.
Amy, I think we lost Noah like a second ago. He dropped. Yeah,
Sorry.
I didn't see him. So
I was too slow. Okay, well then we'll move straight into what has worked or not for you in your relationships before we close out. Naro, can I start with you then?
Yes, for us, what worked was having more support for the wellness and well-being of activists and social justice organizations. And what hasn't worked is having so much paperwork wherein those deadlines become the only source of movement within the organization, wherein essentially the purpose of the activist collective becomes compliance of those deadlines, instead of actually doing the activism work. And this is also becoming the main source of burnout among majority of those whom I have talked with. Thank you.
Thanks, Naro. I couldn't agree more. Nawa, you're back. We are just taking a quick one-liner, what has worked and what hasn't worked in terms of your relationships with funders and enablers.
Amy, I think Noah has terrible internet problems. He just dropped again. He joined and he just dropped. So I think No, look.
He's gone but not forgotten, huh? I keep
Yes.
I keep trying.
We'll see
Okay,
if
no
he can
problem.
join again.
Sure. Otto, how about you? Are you ready?
Certainly, well, this has been a fascinating conversation. I hope we'll have more of this in future, and for some of us just to listen and to absorb. So I think what is important going forward is I think funders need also to embrace disruption. Many of the points that came up seem to suggest that we are not comfortable with disruption, yet we ask of it from others. Every proposal is, okay, how is this disruptive? Yet we are still seem to be stuck in our old ways. We also need to embrace mutual accountability and not just be asking for partners to account. We account back to the partners and have the ability to develop a mutually beneficial relationship. So I think those are some of the things that we need to look at. And failure in achieving a project should also be collective failure. We should not be punishing grassroots communities and activists for failing, quote unquote, to achieve results, because there is no partnership in that type of a model where there is punishment and there's rewards for good or for bad outcomes. So those will be my parting shots, and thank you so much to the activists and colleagues here.
No, thank you. These are like little nuggets of wisdom here. This is fantastic. Sam, how about you? Sam, are you able to join in?
Yes, pardon, I just went off a bit. These connections, but I'm back now. What is the question?
Sorry. In one sentence, what has worked and what hasn't worked in your relationships with funders and enablers?
First of all, that is a very good question, and I would like to begin. Like for TIDE, we do not have a number of funders that we've been working with, but at the moment we have one funder that I really liked our relationships and our collaborations. We recently got support funds from the Global Lead Mobilization Local Solutions Project. And then the way the model is actually invented, it is very, very friendly for activists. They don't have even a lot of questions to ask you. Just a few things, as Dalia mentioned before. Some funders are telling you to write even about 15 pages kind of proposals instead of a concept and few things. It's a hectic work. And they also give you an opportunity. They have a frequent check-in with you. Like, how are you progressing? Are there difficulties you're facing in the implementation of the project? How can this be done? You see, this is the kind of a relationship that we are envisioning that funders should really be able to have with their respective grantees. This would be very, very good. I like that so much. And I think that is just what I want to make around here. I just like the way they do the things. And I feel now if we can be able to embrace such a model, then trust me, a lot of grassroots movements can be able to move on and be able to have something better. And I don't know if you give me a minute to add on some few things that the question you asked now or before. I don't know.
No, I'm so sorry. But I'm really desperately trying to wind this up and respect people's time. But Sam, I'll stay on because I would love to hear your answer after we close. Saranel.
Just very quickly, things that have worked is, creating intentional spaces that use decolonial and racially just methodologies that center the needs, the voices, the experiences of our country teams and partner organizations, and listening, but not just listening with and staying the same, but listening with a view to making those changes, and then being accountable for the commitments that we make to our partners and to our country teams for the changes that we're wanting to make. What and also just getting out of the way, as simple as just getting out of the way. And I think where the resistance comes in is that whiteness doesn't want to get out of the way and doesn't want to give up power. And so that's where the resistance comes in. So it's an ongoing daily 24/7 fight.
Thank you. I like that. Tina, I think you are our final point. We're nearly on time.
1 minute won't be enough, but I do my best. One sentence. So to tell you the truth, 4 days ago, I had a fight with a donor, one European donor. So I can, this is very recent. And what didn't work with this European donor is that they try to choose the solution for my community. They say that because they have the money, they have international experts, they know better than us, grassroots movement, what is the best for our communities. And these international experts didn't even, put their feet in Madagascar even once. And they try to, impose this kind of, it's like the same solution. They think that one solution that worked in another country will work in my country. So yes, last Saturday, I said no to $10,000 because I said that it's better to respect the dignity of my community, we should be considered. We have values. We are not only beggars, and that's why I think it's really important what Sarnel said. This decolonization is essential. People from the South who are looked down by the global North sometimes, and yes, sorry, I feel emotional thinking about it because this morning I had to share to the communities that finally we didn't get the money to support them just because their solution were not considered important for donors. So this is something that is a bad practice that we should denunciate. And what can work? It's mutual respect, understanding, consideration of as I said before, us as invisible expert people on the front line, but doing this job with their passion. We know the realities, and I hope that at least at the end of this webinar, some donors who may behave this way without thinking that it can hurt people. You think about it more, and sorry. That's it for me. Thank you.
Yeah, those were, I'm sorry, and really just an incredible testimony. And thank you for sharing. And I loved seeing your fellow change makers and friends who've joined you in these conversations, kind of rallying around you virtually as you were speaking, reaching out and holding hands. So it's been a beautiful exercise. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. This is something that we're deeply committed to continuing. So if you're interested in participating in future conversations or the campaign, please do reach out to the Civicus resourcing team, and we'll keep the conversation going. Thank you so much to everybody, especially our panelists, and we will speak to you soon. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, everyone.